I think we're ready to begin, so that you can start your post-lunch nap, and then you'll be ready for your regional meetings after this. So welcome back, and this is always a hard time to be talking right after lunch when everybody wants to be having a little siesta. So thanks for coming back. So as I said, as we concluded our morning talk, that in this session we want to talk a little bit about now that we've seen the situation, what is it that perhaps we can begin to do to move forward in the midst of this by creating more intentional Presbyterates today? And how do we work about building up the bond and strengthening the brothers to one another? I have to say that I never really thought about this idea of intentional Presbyterates until about the year 2012, when we had one of our speakers at our first symposium for priests in the middle years. Father Ronald Knott from St. Meinrad Seminary came and spoke to us. And he's done some work over the years on the ongoing formation of priests, and in particular about this idea of intentional Presbyterates, and taking a look at what's happening today. So some of the stuff that I'm going to share is just stolen from Ronald and that. But the question becomes, why do we need to have intentional Presbyterates today? What makes us unique perhaps at this moment in history, different than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago? And I think one of the things that we're seeing is not only within our church or our diocese today, but certainly within our society, that the glue that's kind of holding us together is certainly breaking down. We see this happening in so many different areas. I mean, obviously we've seen it in the breakdown of the family, the nuclear family. We see it in the breakdown of people's interaction with one another, that before it was just common that if I was friends with Rico, not only was I friends with him, but I was friends with all of his friends and knew who his friends were. Now I might be friends with Rico, but he's got another group of 10 other associations of friends, and nobody knows each other and never connect. And so there's becoming a greater sense of discord that's there. And as a result of that, we need to become more intentional about what it means to be a group, what it means to be a family. And if this is true in the midst of our contemporary culture, how much more true then is it within our church culture and within our diocese? That the bond of unity within our presbyterates has slowly been separating in the midst of this. And so Father Ronald Knott talks about the need, then perhaps like no other time in the history of the church, that we need to be more intentional of what it means to be a presbyterate. Remember a number of years ago hearing a speaker talk about this kind of idea of us losing the glue that holds us together in this book that was written called Bowling Alone. I never read the book, and the speaker said not to waste your time reading it, but basically summarized it. And it's based on this premise that's happening in our contemporary culture today, is that people are joining bowling teams. So they still want to bowl. They want to be a part of the team. But unlike what was happening 10, 20 years ago, when everyone on the bowling team showed up on Wednesday night at 9 o'clock to bowl their game, people now bowl their game throughout the week. They never bowl with their team, but they're part of the team. And hence the title of the book, Bowling Alone. They're part of the team, but they're never with the team. And in a sense, we see this happening in so many aspects of our contemporary culture today, as well as then within our presbyterates. And I just thought that that image and that kind of thing of bowling alone speaks a lot about what we see happening within our presbyterates, that we've got a lot of lone rangers for a variety of different reasons that are supposedly part of the group, but are off doing their own thing. And so Father Knott says intentional presbyterates must be willed into existence by those individual members who are concerned enough to make the commitment to see that it happens. The reality is we can't impose this upon people, that you are going to be close, you are going to be a band of brothers, you are going to work together, because that just simply falls apart. but that we have to have people that are interested in doing it and being committed to doing it. And the reality is, this isn't easy, because we can all think of it in our own presbyterates, those guys that, yeah, would be willing to be on board with that, but then those other guys say, don't get me involved in all of this. I don't care, I don't want to do these types of things. And so what do you do in the midst of it? And I think at some point, we just have to be honest about the situation and say, okay, well, if that's the way you're going to be, Father, you go off and do your own thing, but we are going to move forward as a presbyterate. And this is the direction that we're going to take. But it's a challenge in the midst of it. Yet the reality is that sometimes members of presbyterates are set against one another. I'm sure none of us know about this, but historically I'm sure. That they're a house divided rather than a family gathered. Some presbyterates are divided ideologically, camps that vie against one another, reluctant to applaud anyone else's work for fear it will take away from theirs. Some priests would rather do anything than join brother priests for prayer or learning or just fun. Can you think of any, I don't want you to name them, but can you think of anybody in your presbyterate that fits into any of those categories? Do you have names and faces that are there? I mean, it's a sad reality, but it is the reality that is there. And what do we do about it? Tied into the whole midst of this kind of falling apart of the fabric of our presbyterates is surveys, research that began to be done in the early 2000s by Dean Hogan of Catholic University in the United States. And he began doing a variety of different surveys about priests and presbyterates. And back even in the year 2000, so remember the sexual abuse crisis really just was beginning to emerge in the United States at this, so it wouldn't have any effects on the statistics. But even in the year 2002, that they found between 10 and 15% of recently ordained priests resigned within their first 5 years of ministry due to loneliness, feelings of being unappreciated, problems with celibacy, and disillusionment. That's in 2002. And again, when we looked at this recent survey from CARE 2021, aren't those same words, those same issues that are still there? And yet we've got 20 years there. Like, why didn't we learn in the midst of this? Why haven't we put anything in place in the midst of it? And so we see that presbyterates today have been described as a house divided. If priestly unity is the goal, then we must intentionally and accurately identify and honestly confront the divisions that impede and imperil our unity. And there are serious consequences to be faced if these divisions are ignored or left to fester. Once named, they can be addressed. And so before we can have intentional presbyterates, we need to know and to be aware then of what the causes of the division are. And once we can work with those divisions, then we can break forth. And so, taking a look at the various research that has been done over the years, I would say that there are mainly 7 divisions that are causing this tension within our presbyterates today. And we want to take a kind of quick look at some of them. Some of them are pretty simple, that we say, yeah, exactly, and others need a little more explanation. But one of the first causes of division today in our presbyterates is the spirit of competition. And I think in particular, especially for us as men in our culture today, whether it's in the church or whether it's in business or our contemporary society, we know that most men are fueled by this spirit of competition and comparison. And so again, we hear this when somebody gets appointed. Why did he get that parish? Why did he get that appointment? Why has he been named to that office? And so they may not necessarily even want it themselves, but they don't want the other person to have it. And then there's the constant competition about, well, look at how much my parish raised for this fundraising campaign. Look at how much I take in a week for collections. Look at how many baptisms we did. And so there's that constant spirit of competition and comparing to try to justify sometimes how much harder I'm working, how much better my parish is, how much this is having an effect. And so we've got that spirit of competition that's there. A second cause of division is, and we've heard this over and over again from this morning, is the different generations of presbyteries, the different generations of priests in our diocese. And in recent research, they've been showing that there are basically 4 main groups. And I suspect that these are groups that you've heard of before, but it was only when I started doing a little bit more research and was reading a book that talked a little bit more about these various divisions. The book is called Same Call, Different Men, The Evolution of the Priesthood Since Vatican II. And as the author of the book takes a look at these different generations, it kind of breaks it down to give us a better perspective of the mindset of the priests and how that mindset then translates to how we operate and how we relate to one another in ministry. And so the first cohort of generations are the pre-Vatican II cohort. These are comprised of priests that were ordained before 64. They grew up in ethnic Catholic neighborhoods where they were immersed in a supportive and nurturing Catholic culture. As they were discerning their vocation to the priesthood, they received support from their family, their friends, the parishioners. The seminary formation that they received oftentimes began in high school or immediately right after that in college or university. It very much followed a monastic kind of tradition that included Latin. There was a rigid separation from the secular world in which they lived in, and there was very much a formal hierarchy of priestly roles. And so as a result of all of this, the men of this cohort then very much had a vision of priesthood and priestly identity as being men set apart from society. And so again, when each of us look at some of the older guys in our diocese that may probably be retired, many of them, God rest their souls, are dead at this point, but you see that mindset that they were these men set apart, and you now, okay, this makes a little more sense of where all that came from. Also, we see how rectory life was very, very different than what we experience today. Rectory life was very formal. It was very hierarchical. There were several priests that were living together, and one's roles were very clearly defined of what one could and couldn't do. And the pastor was the one that was in charge. This group of priests was very much into institutional loyalty. We protect the church at all costs. And we certainly know that that had both benefits, but we also had some difficulties with it. And of this cohort, the average age of ordination at the time was about 27 years old. So that's the first kind of cohort that we find in most of our dioceses. The second type of cohort then that we find is the Vatican II group. And these were priests that were ordained during Vatican II and the turbulent years after, from 64 to 77. Again, many of these men entered into seminary right after high school or college. But their seminary formation, unlike the previous generation, took place in a period of great flux in the church. At that time, then, seminaries moved away from a more traditional monastic approach and focused much more solely on an academic, even a clinical approach to theology and to ministry. It became the emergence of lay students now for the first time in seminary programs, studying with guys that were looking at ministry. And as a mindset and an identity of priestly life and priestly ministry, they were very much encouraged to see themselves in this servant leader model rather than being set apart. In the midst of this, then, rectory life became more communal and less hierarchical. And as a result of that changed kind of the spirit of what the house was. And then looking at this generation of guys, being a part of the baby boomer generation, these priests tended to place great emphasis on the value of change and questioning institutions, structures, and authority than the previous generation. And, interesting, the average age of ordination didn't change that much in that period, 28 years old. The third group, then, of generations that we see are what is called the post-Vatican II cohort. And again, these were priests that were ordained between 78 and 91. And again, ordained in the first part of the pontificate of now St. John Paul the Great. And so they were very much immersed in the apostolic ministry of JP2. For many, if not all in this cohort, the debates and the divisions of the council were a thing of history, not something that they were imbued in themselves. It was a done deal kind of mentality. But unlike the other two cohorts, these priests grew up with very few experiences of the Catholic subculture that had influenced the previous generations. A lot of those supports, a lot of that stability was not there for these guys. And so they were very much immersed in a secular society and had to seek out their Catholic identity on their own. It was not something that was imbued in the midst of their daily life, even in the midst of their family life. Unlike the previous two generations then that had gone in right after high school at the beginning of college, university, many of these men in this third cohort had already gone to college or some college experience, some type of other work experience before going into the seminary. And these men, when they did enter into the seminary, they entered during a time of decline and reorganization of what the seminary was all about. For the first time, many of these men were more likely to be made pastors in their first years after ordination. Unlike the previous generations who sometimes waited 10, 15, 20 years before becoming a pastor, now all of a sudden, these men have 2, 3, maybe 4 years before being named a pastor. Rectory life then is more likely to be now living alone. There is no more communal dimension. Even those that might have a pastoral associate was very much though in two different directions. The pastor lived his life, the associate lived his life, and many of these guys were also then living alone because they had become pastors at such young ages. And with so many demands on their time and few opportunities for socializing with other priests, they tended to begin to place greater value on priestly identity and fraternity than other generations. And so again, there's that kind of reaction because of all of the demands that are placed upon them. They're beginning to resemble more like that pre-Vatican II understanding of priesthood as the priest set apart. And what's interesting and not surprising that if they've had some college work experience, the average age of ordination for these men has now risen up to about 31 years on average. And so again, they bring in a little bit more of a maturity, bring a little bit more of a life experience. And as a result of that, they perhaps have more clearly defined ideals that are there based on their past. And then the final cohort of our generations are the millennials. And sometimes you hear about these simply being referred to as the JP2 priests. They lived their entire experience of the church after post-Vatican II. And many of them were just coming to age when JP2 was elected in 78. These guys entered the seminary in the midst of the sexual abuse crisis. And so when the building was catching on fire, they were running into it rather than running out of it, which was an interesting thing because many thought for sure that vocations would completely plummet in the midst of the sexual abuse crisis. But in actual fact, they didn't because of the sexual abuse crisis. If anything, men talk about they wanted to become priests more because of the sexual abuse crisis, that they were going to help change the culture. They were going to help purify the church. They were going to help bring things back. And so it's just interesting of how, in the midst of the crisis, it brought on a new generation of priests. As this new generation was coming in, it was also, again, a very much a period of change within the seminary culture today. In the early 1990s, or 80s, excuse me, there were the Vatican mandated visits to the seminary. 1990, there was the International Synod on Priestly Formation. 2 years later, John Paul II's Apostolic Exhortation on Priestly Life, Pastors Dabis Vobis, that changed the whole idea of how seminaries were to be guided in the 4 pillars of priestly formation. And then there was the new edition of the Program for Priestly Formation that came out in '93 to catch up with all of those things that had taken place in those recent years, to be able to give a more holistic and a more solid basis of seminary formation. And so there was much more emphasis then in terms of seminary formation of adhering to kind of what Rome was asking and putting into place both the PPE as well as Pastor Dabis Vobis, that many of us in the seminary heard about constantly when we were there. It was the new in thing and the new mantra. And as a result of all of this, how were these seminarians then defining themselves? Well, the seminarians were more likely to define themselves as a man set apart than the 2 cohorts before them. So they were very much, in terms of their priestly identity, looking at themselves like the priests before Vatican II. And so again, when we take a look at some of the trends that are happening with some of our recently ordained, the trends towards cassocks and berettas, the trend towards the extraordinary form of the Mass, and all of these things, you can see that they haven't come out of nothing, but they have come out of a generation of the past. And I don't think guys are trying to be kind of vicious in the midst of it, but I think in the midst of the instability that they've experienced throughout their lives, both their home life as well as the institutional life of the church, they're simply trying to look for stability. I remember reading a book a number of years ago entitled something, Why Young Americans Are Embracing Catholic Orthodoxy. And the premise of the book talked about why are university and colleges, campuses in the United States, so many of the young people, and I put so many in quotations because we know they're limited, but so many of those young people that are attracted to the Latin Mass, that are attracted to Eucharistic adoration, that are attracted to the bells and whistles of incense and all of those types of things in liturgy. And the research and the premise is that these young people had been through so much already in their short span of life, 20 years, experienced so much instability that they were looking for a sense of stability in their lives. And as a result of that, those types of things brought about a sense of stability. The other thing that the research showed is that with these young people, 20-ish years of age, already in their life, they had almost experienced everything. They had been induced into a sexualized culture at a young age. They had seen the breakdown of their families and relationships. They had gone through all sorts of things at a young age. And now they were looking and wondering, is there something more in life? Or is this all there is? And so the bells and the whistles, the Latin, the incense, the chimes, even Eucharistic adoration, was a sense of trying to get mystery back in their lives, to bring them into something other than the worldliness that's there. And I think we're still seeing this today. When you go to, again, they're small in number, don't get me wrong, but of those young people that are practicing, when you look at what's happening with CCO and NET and some of those other organizations, who are they attracting today? And what are they attracted to? They're going to Eucharistic adoration. They're developing a prayer life. They want to be in community with other people that share their same values. They're looking for that sense of mystery and that sense of stability in their lives. And as a result, as those young people begin to mature and go off to our seminaries and get ordained, no wonder they're attracted to some of those things that are there. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's just something we have to note and to understand what's happening. And so that sense of being a man set apart versus this servant leadership model that was there after the Second Vatican Council. We know that they're more likely to be named pastors in just a few years or in a few days after ordination, as we're hearing more and more. And again, rectory life means living alone. Again, they have very few experiences of living in communal life. And again, like the previous generation, they don't have a lot of opportunities both for socialization with other priests. And so again, they place that sense of priestly identity and trying to find those opportunities for priestly fraternity. And again, interesting, in the US at least, the average age has now jumped to 37 years old. Again, when you take a look at the pre-Vatican II, that first cohort, the average age was 27, and now the average age here is 37. And so I think that when we take a look, I mean, obviously this is very simplistic of these four groups. There could be certainly much more said of it. But I think these highlights help us to be able to see the dynamics that are at work and play there, and why there are those dynamics at play. And I think at least if we can begin to better understand one another, better understand our brothers and where they're coming from, it begins a starting point for some discussions about how we can move forward, instead of just saying, oh, that's Father so-and-so, he's like that. Thoughts, comments about the generation? Is that helpful? Does that resonate?
I think it's sometimes still like for us who are not as young, how do we relate to those who we're experiencing, trying to go, we're still wondering your information gives us good information, but we're always wondering, why are they going back to Catholics? When the people who were going through Vatican II were glad to get rid of the Catholics, kind of deal. So it's almost the other extremes now. So there is a division still among the older priests and the younger priests on this whole thing.
Yep. I really enjoyed the image of, you mentioned a house divided versus a family gathered. And to me, you put the emphasis on, we're going to have to be intentional about gathering together. But it's okay to be divided on theological issues. Forget about that. Sorry, don't forget about that. But keep your values, put them forward, but know that what's more important is, are you willing to sit with your brother, sister, whoever?
Exactly, that we don't have to agree on everything, but we can still, just like in a family, we don't have to agree on everything. But at the end of the day, we're still a family. Yeah. We still live under that one roof, and we're still moving towards a common goal. Yeah?
No, that's good.
So a third area of division is clerical envy, this spirit of jealousy that's there. And we see this in so many different ways of how that is lived out in the midst of our presbyterates. Of again, how many guys are simply jealous of other guys that seem to be doing well, and then will try to undermine them, or try to demean them. I have a priest in my own diocese that whenever I try something new, it's always, oh, so you got another make work project. I mean, he's one of the laziest guys in our diocese, but rather than own up to his own laziness and all of that, it's easier to attack other people and, oh, that's another John make work project and all of that. But there's that spirit of jealousy that's there. And that spirit of jealousy then, I don't want you to do well, because then I'm not going to look well in the midst of it. And we see that in so many different fronts, and how divisive that can be in the midst of it. And then, I mean, especially when brother priests then start talking to lay people about brother priests, and the constant put-downs that are there, and the constant labeling, and the constant judgments. That's not healthy, nor is it holy. A fourth area of division is the lack of attention from the bishop. Again, we've spent a lot of time talking about some of these aspects this morning. But again, you've got those guys that are looking for the attention of the bishop, and there are the other guys like, if I see the bishop's calling, I'm not answering the phone, and everything in between their kind of mentality. But there's no common vision about how do we see the role of the bishop as a spiritual father? What is it that we expect as a presbyterate from our spiritual father? And so again, that causes that sense of division, because it's either the bishop is always telling us what to do or the bishop tells us nothing kind of mentality and all of that. Obviously, a fifth major division that's happening within our presbyterates is varied backgrounds. Again, as we're seeing these new cohorts that are coming up, they have much more varied work experience, much more varied life experience in the midst of that before entering into the seminary. And so those backgrounds, again, then affect the way that they interact with one another, interact with their brother priests. And again, the divisions that can be caused by just simply life and work experience. The sixth area building on that is varied theologies and spiritualities, and the struggles that are there. You've got the right, you've got the left, you've got the social justice, you've got the liturgy wars, you've got the vaccination pandemic wars, and all of those things that tie into people's theological and spiritual kind of theology, and the mix mash that's there. And how do we keep all of that together? It's not to say that some of those things are wrong, but how do we work together and we don't have to take sides in the midst of it? And then the seventh major division that we see is the various languages, cultures, places of origin in our presbyterates, and how, again, that affects the unity that is there. And again, as we're lucky enough in Canada to welcome a number of our brother priests from other countries, how does that relationship work? How is it that they fit into us, but how is it that we also fit into them? Like, we often see it as a one-sided thing, but there are gifts and talents on both sides. And how do we receive that? But how do we incorporate that? And so again, that often can cause a sense of division. And again, in some larger dioceses, then you see these little groups. Well, these are the priests from this area, or this area, forming their own little tribes kind of mentality. And so when you go to a diocesan function, you get all of those guys in one corner, and all the others in this corner, and all of that. And nobody's talking to each other. Nobody's socializing with each other. And again, how does that create a healthy dynamic, a healthy presbyterate? Other areas of division that aren't covered in those broad 7 categories that you've seen. Or any?
I would like to comment on number 7,
Yeah.
the code 7. It's my personal experience. I tell you this, 29 years ago, when I was ordained priest, only me, the Vietnamese, another guy, 2 Vietnamese in the diocese. And wherever we gather, the priest functions like a retreat, we always talk English. 10 years later, we have groups of Filipinos join, Africans join, East Indians join. So after that, every time we gather, priests gather for retreat, your number 7 there. Each one have go different groups and talk their own languages. And nobody say anything. Until last year, in my report, Pierre, I will share with you later. Until last year, some people spoke up right after the retreat for comment. And they said, it's not fair. You know, you talk different languages and nobody understands. I don't know, that John, you have to consider it this way. It is cultural works, cultural shocks. Do we still, I feel that personally, if I in front of you, I don't want to speak Vietnamese in front of you because you don't understand. It's to be fair. But sometimes we gather in group, we talk. You know, Filipinos, we talk. East Indians, we talk in Indians. And they just brought up after retreat in May. And then I felt, yeah, to be fair, if we have to respect each other, for me, I can speak English. I don't mind to talk with Vietnamese group. I can talk in English too. But it's how do we bring it up to be fair for people, not hurt anyone. That's the main thing I would like to share here. How do we balance or share with others without hurting? That's the way.
Thanks. Yeah, and it's a real challenge that's there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how do we respect the diversity, but also build the unity that's there? Yeah. Other comments about the divisions? So kind of knowing all of this and what we've seen, how do we move kind of forward? And I think one of the important things that I think we're seeing is that we as priests and when we're seminarians, we get no training in what it means to be a part of the Presbyterates. I don't know, at least my experience from St. Pete's. Other guys, I mean, did you ever hear any discussions when you were in seminary about what it means to be a part of the Presbyterates? Anybody?
No.
And so isn't that one of the first fundamental problems and ways that we need to address this is we spend a lot of time talking about other issues in seminary formation, but we spend no time in seminary formation about what it means to be a part of the Presbyterate and about how to grow in that healthy sense of the Presbyterate. And so as a result of this, what we see happening more and more then is this mindset of moving into private practice. Yeah, I'm ordained by the bishop, but then I go to my parish, as we were talking just before lunch, and I just go and do my own thing. I don't care what the chancery has to say. I don't care what Father so-and-so is doing down the street. This is my show, and I'm going to run it this way, and all of that. Because we have no sense that we're in this together. We have no sense of that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And so as a result of that, we get then these little groupings of things that are happening in our diocese. And so those that want this happening will then work together, but they'll ignore everybody else. And so we see the emergence of these kind of tribes, as they call them, within Presbyterates. And again, not only do we see that happening played out in their pastoral practice in their parishes, but then when they go to priest council or priest gatherings and things, they're the only ones that socialize together. They're the only ones that eat together. They're the only ones that do things together. And so again, there's no openness or receptivity to others or to being a part of it. So I think that that's one of the things that we really have to seriously look at. And maybe it might be an issue that the Federation needs to begin to raise those conversations amongst your representatives and with your bishops is, what does it mean for us to be a presbytery? We have to start beginning to talk about that. And how do we incorporate that into seminary formation and also into the life of our seminaries that are a part of our diocese already? But as much as we don't get a whole lot of training about presbyterates as seminarians, as priests, the reality is that bishops are oftentimes just as clueless. And I don't say that meanly, but I mean they get no training in how to lead a presbyterate. They get no training in how do I move this forward? And how then do they get that to be able to assist them? Because again, what happens is the bishop is supposed to be the shepherd of the diocese. If the bishop is supposed to be the spiritual father, but doesn't know where he's going or what to do, how is that going to lead to a healthy sense of the presbytery, a healthy sense of the diocese? And so again, I think that that's something that our bishops are becoming a bit more conscious about. But it's an area I think that we still have a lot of growth to go into. What does it mean for the bishop to be the spiritual father? And I mean, God bless these men. I mean, they are some of the most hardworking men that I know of. And the demands that are placed upon them, day in and day out, I don't know how many of them do it. And so by the time it gets down to, I've got to create a healthy presbyterate, they're just simply exhausted because they've dealt with 3 different lawyers on 3 different use cases, and they've got this happening and that happening. And so I don't think it's any ill intention of our bishops, but I think it's a question of just a lack of, at times, education, but also a lack of time and energy to there. Because I think the reality is what research and conversations have shown us, is that priests want to be led by their bishop. They want to have that strong, convincing voice that's there, but it doesn't seem to be happening. And as a result then, we just simply begin to start doing our own thing. And that's never a healthy thing. In the midst of all of this, we talked a little bit about seminaries already, is how is seminary formation today reflecting the reality of what priestly ministry and priestly life is all about? And so again, I'm not saying that we need to have a radical overhaul of seminary formation. By and large, I think they do lots of great things. But in the midst of it, now that we're looking at guys, after 8 years of being in the seminary, becoming pastors and having none of that kind of internship experience of growing into all of this, that are going to be living alone from day one, how does community life in the seminary prepare us for that reality when now all of a sudden you are on your own? And yet, how does the seminary help prepare us for that reality? And so again, I think that that's a conversation that seminary people need to begin to have, and to be able to help guys to be able to recognize that, yes, I may be living and working alone, but I'm also a part of this presbyterate, and I have to work together and in unity with others, even those that I don't necessarily like or agree with from a theological or spiritual standpoint, but that we're brother priests in this diocese. And so again, moving away from that idea of being these lone rangers in the midst of our parish. So one of the things that Father Knott says is that ultimately what is needed is for presbyteral unity is not a new program, because programs just aren't going to work if we don't have a change of heart. We need to have a new mindset. And that's hard to be able to work at. Remember one year we were at a priest retreat with the English priests of my diocese, and all of them were there except for one of the priests. And we were talking about partially how can we build a priestly fraternity, how can we help better minister each other in our parishes. And so the proposal that I had made, because again, we're a small diocese, we had 5 English priests at the time. I said, why don't we have a traveling priest reconciliation roadshow during Lent? That we would all give a week up of our time, and that we would go to each other's parish. We would do confessions in the school. We would have an evening meal together. We would have a parish reconciliation service, and then we could have a couple of drinks at night, and the next day go to the next parish and do the same thing. Everybody was on board that was there. The one guy that wasn't at the meeting came out when he heard about this, and this scathing letter to all of us of how we were trying to take over things and overstep and all of this, and that we were forming, his word was a cabal, and all of this. Like, it might have worked, it might have flopped, but we were all willing to try it except for him. And it died because he was the Lone Ranger. He didn't want us coming into his school. He didn't want us coming into his parish. He didn't want others looking good and him not. And so we had to destroy it all. And so again, it's not a new program that we need, but it's this new mindset, this conversion of heart that happens. And unless we have that conversion of heart, we're going to have the same things, doing it over and over and over again. And so this moving towards an intentional presbyterate, it's one thing to be able to diagnose what the problem is, and I think we can all readily see what the problems are in our own diocese and overall. But then it's the hard work of what do we do now to fix it? And it's not going to happen overnight. And that's why, like I said, Father Knott coined this word that I haven't seen before this, of this intentional presbyterate. That we can't just leave it to chance, but we have to be intentional about it. I mean, we're seeing this word now emerge with Sherry Waddell and others about intentional discipleship and all of that. Well, we need to take that step back as Presbyterates. How do we become intentional in what we are doing as priests so that we can then have intentional disciples? And again, it's interesting when we take a look at the word intentional. It comes from the Latin word which means to stretch towards, to aim at. And so again, we're not talking that something's necessarily going to be perfection in our diocese, but we're aiming towards something different, something better. And so it has to be an act of the will in which we desire to be able to do something. And if we're not ready to do that, then no matter what program the Federation imposes, no matter what program the bishop imposes on us, it's not going to work. But how do we convince our brothers of that need to have a change of heart? How do we help work in that conversion that needs to happen? And so it's one of those things is that we not only have to want it, but that we have to be willing to do it. Again, I remember one of our old priests in our diocese, we were gathered in a study days, and one of our former bishops was kind of complaining to us because we had talked about that we wanted to form small faith sharing groups in the parishes. And he had brought in, we had a study day on it, and then 6 months later, 9 months later, nothing happened. And the bishop said, like, I don't understand, you asked for this. And one of our old wise priests says, well, Bishop, just because we asked for it doesn't mean we really want it. And isn't that true? I mean, yeah, we want intentional presbyteries, we want to get along, we want to do this, but do we really? Just because we want it, do we really want it? And so we've got to be able to have more than just a desire, but it has to be that intention. And so kind of moving to a little bit more practical kind of things then, saying, okay, John, that's really great, so what do we do about it? Well, what can individual priests do? The thing is, as we talked about, there's no magical program that's going to happen. And only a group change of heart can happen, as we know, like all conversions, one heart at a time. And that's what's going to lead to the renewal. It's not going to happen overnight. And so it's that individual conversion, that individual working. And so I think the challenge, the question that we ask ourselves, if you bring this back to your presbyterates, is like, what am I individually, John, Rael, Rico, prepared to do to build a more unified, intentional presbyterate? And again, it's not going to solve everything. We're not going to get all of the guys on board, but can we start with some of the guys? And so again, some of the questions that I just begin to ask myself is trying to envision, how do I build a more intentional presbyterate in my area? Is asking yourselves questions like, how do I welcome and support seminarians that are a part of my diocese? Again, this idea that sometimes, well, that's the work of the vocation director, and I shouldn't have anything to do with that kind of mentality. But again, how do we welcome those guys? How do we support those guys? What would it take if you sent at the beginning of September a note to the guy at the seminary? Really glad that you're studying for our diocese. Know that I'm praying for you. Can you imagine what the guy would feel like if he gets this from some priest who has no idea who he is in his diocese? But saying, Father so-and-so took the time to write me a little note. He's praying for me. Again, you hear sometimes horror stories of guys that come back to their home parish at Christmas time, and the pastor doesn't even talk to them. I mean, so how do we welcome, how do we support seminarians and not expect that it's just the job of the bishop, it's just the job of the vocation director, it's just the job of the vicar for clergy? We have a priest friend who was a former vocation director and did lots of great work as a vocation director, but realized after he finished his term, that doesn't mean I stopped being a vocation director. And so every year he makes it a point to travel to the seminary and to take the guys of his diocese out for dinner. He doesn't have to do that. He's not reimbursed by the diet. He chooses to do that as his way of just trying to support the guys and to encourage them to say, there are others of us that are really grateful for you being here. It's a kind of a simple gesture, but it's a powerful gesture to these guys to know that they are not alone in the midst of it. Again, some dioceses do some of these things well. They welcome seminarians to their study days and to priestly fraternity days, but others, we just leave them off in the dark. Again, a question to ask ourselves is, individually, how am I going to welcome and support the newly ordained priest in my diocese? Yeah, you may not be my associate, may not even be in my deanery, but have I ever picked up the phone to reach out to him and say, how are you doing? You've been ordained 3 months. You've been in this parish. How are you doing, Father? Have we said, do you want to go out for lunch? Can we get together and go for golf or whatever kind of mentality? But how do we begin to create those bonds and create those relationships? Again, how is it that we welcome new priests that come into our diocese? And how do we show them that not only are we happy that they're with us, but how can I support you in the midst of this? You're new to this, you may never have run a First Reconciliation program. Is there something I can help you with? Is there anything that you need in the midst of all of this? And so, how do we reach out to that? Or do we say, well, that's not my problem, I'm busy enough with my work and all of this? And then I think another area that we often neglect is, how do we reach out and support our retired priests? These guys that have served faithfully for years and years in our diocese. And all of a sudden, just because they're retired, just because we may not even know them that they've been retired that long, how do we reach out and say, Father, can I stop by for a visit? I'd like to just have a chat with you. I'd like to hear your vocation story at some point. Again, how do we include them that they're not forgotten after all of their hard work? Again, to ask ourselves individually, how do I build this fraternity with my brother priests? Not just the ones that I like, that I hang out with all the time on my day off, or that I go out on Friday night, but how about the other guys that I don't normally hang around with, or that I don't normally like? Can I do something with them? Can I reach out in some way? Again, another issue, how do I build fraternity with my bishop? And again, we're not talking about being best friends. But again, some of those simple things that I talked about earlier. Do I send him a birthday card, an anniversary card? Do I thank him if he gives us something? Do I ever invite him out to go for dinner some night outside of when he has to be there for confirmation? I mean, those are all simple gestures that are there. Again, looking at the broader picture, how do I work with neighboring priests and parishes? Again, so that I build that sense of unity. Can we work together on some joint projects? We're doing sacramental prep together. How can we work together? How can we discuss it? Doesn't mean we have to do everything the same, but can we talk about that? And again, how do I build bridges with diocesan staff so that they know who I am and I know who they are? And again, so when I'm getting that email from them, I have a face to who is sending it, and they have a face to who they're sending it. So I think those are just, they may seem simplistic, but they're starting points of how it is that we can begin to change the dynamics within our diocese. And it begins with ourselves. Questions, comments? Overly simplistic?
No.
So the first layer is, what is it that I can do? The second thing then, taking a look, is what can bishops do? Well, we know that ultimately, by the theology our church gives to us, the responsibility for building a unified presbyterate falls on the shoulders of the bishop. But again, oftentimes, as we've said, they're either ill-equipped for the task, or it can just simply get off of their priority list because there are so many other demands that are there. And therefore, it's important that we help encourage our bishops to get the support that they need to be able to lead that presbyterate. As the basic plan for the ongoing formation of priests says, the ongoing formation of individual priests is one thing, but the ongoing formation of presbyterates in their unity is another thing. And again, we've often placed so much emphasis on the initial formation of priests, but what about that ongoing formation? That's why one of the things that maybe some of you have more experience, I just know peripherally about it, but the Catholic Leadership Institute that's out of the States have been doing some really good work with both bishops and with priests and presbyterates about forming these healthy presbyterates. Do any of your dioceses have any connection or any involvement with the Catholic leadership? I know the Diocese of London has been doing some. I think Hamilton, can you say anything?
Yeah, we did the Good Leaders with Shepherds program.
Yes?
I think together with Toronto at one point.
Yeah.
And now actually, next week, guys have a shorter version of it, those who never participated as well, empowering the shepherds. Very good program.
Yeah. And so there's some contact information there about it. If your diocese has it, it might be something you might want to look into, something that might have a speaker for study days or something, at least to begin that, that kind of conversation in the midst of it. Like I said, I've certainly heard good things. I know that they have also gatherings for bishops that have gathered together, and I think, I mean, they're smart. They have it in January in Florida, which bishop doesn't want to get away from the cold and the misery that's there. But again, helping them to understand, what does it mean to be a shepherd? What does it mean to be a leader today? And then finally, I mean, what can presbyterates do? I think one of the things that's really important is that we need to pay attention to the transition of young priests out of the seminary and into the work of ministry. And again, it's something that I don't think we really pay any attention to. This goes into some of the questions we've talked about already about how guys get assigned to parishes, and do we just plunk them in there, or is it going to be good or healthy for them? But when we're losing 10 to 15% of our guys within the first 5 years of ministry, it says to me that there's something that's missing in the formula that's there. And so how do we work towards that? I mean, certainly one of the big issues that's there, and there's no easy answers, but I mean, how do we mentor these newly ordained guys, especially if they're going to be sent out to be pastors right away and have no opportunity to live with a pastor and learn to be what it is, a priest, and to be an associate, and to how to take those things. And so again, this idea, though, of mentoring shouldn't just be left to that one priest that's assigned. Now, again, we don't want to meddle, but I mean, all of us can be mentors to the recently ordained, to those that are coming into the diocese, by that simple phone call, by that simple outreach. Do you want to go out for lunch? How are things going? And so again, if each of us were to become more involved with this, it would strengthen the unity of the presbyterate and also help create more healthy relationships. As someone once said, we need to stop introducing new priests on the day of their ordination to the presbyterate. This is the first time that Father so-and-so is a part of our presbyterate. No, since the time he was at least accepted as a candidate, let alone a seminarian for the diocese, he should be a part of these things. And so we need to be able to work on that ongoing sense of being a part of the presbytery from a young age with these seminarians. And again, if they can see this healthy sense that I'm a part of all of this, how will that translate once they are ordained as priests? But if they never get to experience that, then we plunk them in, and how do they know what to expect and how to live and how to be? Again, with our international brothers that are here, again, how is it that we receive them, but how do we also learn from them in the midst of this? And again, I think one of the issues you're going to be talking about on Thursday is the whole enculturation programs, and how does all of that work? And there's no easy answers. Having studied a number of programs around the table with the Commission for Priests over the years, it's a huge issue, that there are no simple answers, but we've got to be able to work at doing something. And then again, just reminding ourselves that, again, all of this, I think, creating more intentional, more healthy presbyterates begins the day that a guy becomes a seminarian. And so that seminaries need to be able to be involved in this work. That, again, as I've mentioned before, having some type, it doesn't have to be a course, we don't need more courses, we don't need to extend the program, but how can we best utilize the time of the guys in the seminary to talk about presbyterates, to talk about what it means to be there, and what it means to be a part of a bond, and not to become these lone rangers. And so how do we incorporate that into seminary life today? And so again, I think some of these conversations need to happen at a multi-level. I was saying to some of the guys at the table, like, I would really like, we should have a round table that brings together bishops, vocation directors, seminary formators, the Federation, and begin to have these conversations of how do we help grow these intentional presbyterates so that we can help not only strengthen the unity of our brothers, but save some of our brothers that are leaving in great droves of 10 to 15% of guys in these first years of ministry. Thoughts, comments in our last 30 seconds? If not, I'll invite us to close this with a prayer that Father Knott wrote that I think it's a 2-slide prayer, just to let you know, or more, I guess, 4. But perhaps we could pray this. But this is the prayer that he wrote about priest's prayer for his presbyterate. So maybe we can pray together. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Together. Loving God, I ask for your special blessing on all the priests of my presbyterate. Help us to remember always that we do not work alone, but that we work in the sacramental brotherhood, under the leadership of our bishop, a ministry to lead for which we are all responsible. For the sake of our unified and coherent ministry, help us to remember that the ministry we do is not just personal, but a share in our bishop's ministry. For that reason, keep us always respectful of and obedient to his leadership. Help us to be diligent in our ministry, absorbed in it, so that our commitment may be evident and our service helpful. Help us to take good care of ourselves and to be attentive to becoming more effective in our service. Show us ways to encourage our brothers in the seminary, those in formation who will someday be partners with us in the service of the church. Help us to set a good example for them in all that we do. Support our sick, retired, and absent brothers in your loving care. I ask this in the name of the Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.